Welcome to this special ILEDA Learning Lab podcast. The Learning Lab is one of the ongoing professional development benefits for members of ILEDA, the International Law Enforcement Educators and Trainers Association. ILEDA is an organization dedicated to advancing the law enforcement profession through the development of trainers and educators and the sharing of information, research, strategies, principles, and concepts related to effective teaching and learning. The Learning Lab currently contains over 150 interviews with ILEDA members on a wide range of topics related to advancing law enforcement training. In an effort to share the experience and knowledge of ILEDA members with everyone in the law enforcement training community, we are publicly releasing some of these interviews in a bi-weekly podcast. After listening to this interview, we encourage you to go to ILETA.org, that's ILEETA.org, and find out how you can become a part of this community of trainers dedicated to serving the heroic men and women of the law enforcement profession by investing in their professional development in order to provide the best possible training. Please enjoy this interview and feel free to contact us at info@ileta.org if you have any questions. I'm Brian Willis, the Deputy Executive Director for ILEDA and your host for the ILEDA Learning Lab. And today's interview is with Frank Trammer, and we're talking about transforming police culture. Frank is the founder and CEO of Guardian Leadership and is a dynamic and influential speaker and trainer in the areas of leadership and personal development. Frank has a diverse public safety background, having worked for more than 20 years in state, county, and municipal law enforcement. He currently serves as a Deputy Chief of Police at the Georgia Tech Police Department and is an adjunct professor at Georgia Tech and Columbus State University, where he teaches leadership. So, Frank, welcome to the ILEDA Learning Lab.
Well, thank you for having me, Brian. It's an honor. I appreciate the opportunity to share.
Now, following the 2021 conference, a couple people reached out to me, people that I highly respect, and said, hey, you need to interview Frank. And you and I met in person a number of years ago. And now your class description says, during this interactive presentation, you will learn how to intentionally foster a positive culture that leads to transformational change. We will explore major obstacles that have impeded the progress of professional policing and steps police trainers and leaders must take to improve. This presentation examines the challenges of police culture, the importance of training and leadership in addressing these challenges, and practical steps for creating an environment where trust flourishes, problems get solved, and expectations are exceeded. And so you and I share a common passion for this concept of addressing culture. So what are some of the key elements in this as far as, do you start with obstacles, or where do you want to start this discussion, Frank?
Well, I think it probably would start us just to, it would be a benefit for us all just to get on the same page about what is culture. And so when you think about the definition, the textbook definition, so to speak, is the shared values, belief systems, attitudes, and customs that control an organization or its members' interactions with each other and those outside the organization. And that's kind of, that's the textbook definition. But really, when we're talking about culture, I think more simply defined, culture simply is nothing more than the way that we do things around here. And so we really have to ask ourselves, based on who we want to become, the way that we're carrying ourselves, our behaviors, is it consistent with what we're trying to accomplish as an organization? And I believe within our culture, the culture of public safety, the culture of law enforcement specifically, that there are things that need to change. We hear a lot of things going on around the country about transforming the police, and I don't know about you, Brian, but I'm one of the first people to tell you that there are things that need to change. There are things that we need to transform, and there are things that we need to do within our culture to improve the condition of our profession. Now, I don't believe that some of the suggestions or some of the things that are occurring across the country right now are the appropriate way to go about things. But I do believe that there are a number of things that are not serving our profession well, and there are things that need to change. And that's really what this presentation was about identifying those things and starting a conversation about those areas of our culture that need to improve.
Excellent. And I mean, I agree with you that there are certainly things within our culture that we need to change. The concern I have with a lot of the current narrative is it's just you need to change, you need to reform, but that's it. And there's a lot of finger pointing and blaming, and I don't think that's helpful to anyone. So, what are some of these areas of the culture that you have seen in your 2 decades of service and all the work you do with leadership that we need to start having a conversation about and looking to change and transform within the profession?
Yeah, so I've identified, and what I taught and what I believe is really there are five major obstacles that are impacting the progress of professional policing. And I didn't make up many of these. As a matter of fact, one of the resources that I would suggest those who are listening to read is a book that was written some years back by former police chief of Madison, Wisconsin. His name was David Cooper. And he wrote a book called Arrested Development. And what he said is, while much has changed in policing regarding tactics and technology and how we investigate crime, that not much has changed in our culture in terms of who police officers are, how we interact with one another, and those that we serve. And he identified in the book a number of problems that he has seen historically that have remained unchanged. And one of the major obstacles, I believe, and this is why I believe leadership is so important, because one of the things that we teach at Guardian Leadership, and one of the things that I believe, is that really and truly leadership is everything. Whether your organization succeeds or fails, whether your family succeeds or fails, and whether you personally succeed or fail, all hinges on leadership. And one of the major obstacles I see is that there is a vacuum, or there's a void, rather, of quality leadership within our profession. I believe that many of the programs out there, the training programs, are supervision and management centric, and many of us, I believe, understand that those two things are not the same. It's important. You manage processes. You don't manage people. You lead people. People want to be led. They don't want to be managed. And I believe that leadership, and there's some studies I can share with you, that leadership is a huge component, and it's really, I think, the largest piece that we need to address if we want to improve the culture. The other obstacle that I see is something that David Cooper coined in his book, and he called it Anti-Intellectualism. And essentially what he was saying is most police organizations are not learning organizations. For that matter, many people in general, once they get out of high school or college or whatever that looks like to them, they never pick up another book throughout their lives. Very seldom does that happen. So he says that most police organizations, we're not learning organizations. We go to training, but we're not invested really in our personal growth and development outside of things that we are mandated to do. The other obstacle that I see is we have issues with discourtesy. A lot of complaints that come through, it's not necessarily what the officer did, it's how they came across in their interactions with the community. And I believe that the same is true within our organizations, that sometimes we don't demonstrate courtesy and respect for members within our own organizations. And so, we really could go a long way in terms of improving our relationships with the community if we focus more time, effort, and training on how to communicate with people. And I know that there's some things that are being offered out there, verbal influence and defense, and verbal judo was the thing of the past. But, really we need to be talking about our people and reinforcing the way that we treat folks. We'll talk a little bit later about police legitimacy and procedural justice, and those things are very important, but it needs to be practiced internally as well within the organization before it's manifest externally. Another obstacle that I see is really there's an over-reliance on tactics and an under-reliance on common sense and communication. Much of what we do, much of our training involves things that relate to use of force. And while those things are absolutely essential, they're very important, those things are not used the majority of the time. Most of the time we're interacting with the community. It doesn't involve a situation where we're having to utilize force. And we do very little in terms of problem solving and decision-making training and communications training. Much of what we do focuses on those high liability topics, whether it be defensive tactics or firearms or emergency vehicle operations, and we don't spend nearly enough time focused on some of the other areas. And then the last thing, that I believe really plagues our culture is what I call, I say corruption, but I'm not talking about corruption in the typical sense. I'm talking about corruption of the heart, corruption of the spirit. And I believe that a lot of officers who are out there doing this job, they've lost perspective, they lost purpose, they've lost insight as to why they do this job to begin with, and the significant impact that it has in the lives of other people. And I believe that it's a leadership issue also, because it's important for us as leaders to remind people of the job that they do and the importance of this line of work. I believe it's one of the most noble professions, if not the most noble profession in the world. And it's unfortunate to see where we find ourselves with mass exodus from organizations and difficulties in recruiting and bringing people into the organization. And if we want to change things, we really have to make a paradigm shift. And so, really just kind of scratching the surface, those are the 5 things that we can explore in a little further detail. But as I see it, those are the 5 major things that I think need to change within our profession.
Excellent. Great points, all of them, and I'd like to break them down. So let's go back to the leadership is everything and the void of quality leadership. I have my thoughts on why we've got ourselves into this position. What do you see as some of the factors that have led to this void of quality leadership within the profession?
Well, before we get into that, if I could just, some people may be familiar with this, but there was a recent survey that was put out by our friends at Caliber Press, and they polled 10,000 officers. It was last year, from various ranks, backgrounds, and tenure, and they had administered a poll. There were a number of questions that were asked to really assess the state of policing, and one of the things that there were actually 2 things from that survey I took away from it that was very telling. One of the things they asked was, looking back on your career, if you had it to do all over again, would you? And it really was disheartening to see that almost 2/3 of people who responded to this survey, 61.7%, as a matter of fact, said that they would not. They would do something different. And then you look at, I believe that the American City Administrators Association puts this out, but they were looking at public sector jobs, and law enforcement is the number 1 job in public safety, or in the public space, the government space, that people are no longer applying for. And in line with that same survey, one of the questions they asked is, would you encourage a son or daughter to go into law enforcement? And that was very telling, because only 7.5% of people who responded to that survey said that they would. Over 80% said absolutely not, and there were about 12.3% that were uncertain. And when they broke it down about why you wouldn't encourage your own children to pursue this profession, they identified 4 major themes. And one of the major themes was safety concerns. 58.5% people cited that it was officer safety. We know that this is a dangerous job. We know what we signed up for. The other thing that they cited, and it was 63% said that it was really related to poor working conditions. The increased legal liability that officers are facing, the job duties have changed for the worse. And so there were some legitimate concerns there. Moving up the scale, 83% of them said that it was a lack of respect for the profession. But, again, I believe that this is, and it's not that I believe, there's actually some factual data to support this, that this is quote-unquote fake news. Forbes puts out a study every year about the most trusted professions in the United States. And I know you're in Canada, Brian, but in the United States, America's most and least trusted professions, even last year's survey, police officers were number 5. Nurses were number 1, doctors, pharmacists, high school teachers, and police officers. Even with the state that we found ourselves in, police officers are among, and have been for the last several decades, one of the most trusted professions in the world. And I think that's why when an officer does something, that it causes a lot of the things that we see. We're a very trusted profession, and so when an officer violates that community trust, it's something that's newsworthy. It's something that makes the news. But the vast majority of the community, if you look at the survey data, does support law enforcement and what it is that we do. I believe that it's a minority portion of the community that really doesn't. But the number one thing, Brian, and to tie this all back together, the number one thing they said was they wouldn't encourage their son or daughter to get in this line of work. 88% said because it was a lack of departmental support. And I think when you break that down, what we're talking about is culture and leadership. People understand the nature of the job, but they look at this profession, they say, you know what, I don't want to place my child in a sick environment. I don't want to place my child in an organization that they're not supported, not just, the perception externally, but also internally. And so that's a leadership issue as I see it. And in our organizations, we have a lot of sick guardians out there. Work is making people sick. There was actually an interesting study that I read in a book called Dying for a Paycheck. It was written by a guy named Jeffrey Pfeiffer. And this study tracked employees and found, it was looking at people's moment-by-moment well-being throughout the day, and found that just 1 of 39 experiences rated lower than being at work in a bad organization, in a bad culture, and that was being home sick in bed. And within our organizations, we have many sick guardians. We're dealing with unprecedented vacancies in our organizations. Workplace stress is at an all-time high. We have people leaving our agencies because of the stigma, and their only solution to getting better seems to be by leaving. But there's a solution beyond that, I believe, and it begins with us removing some of the obstacles and creating a culture of leadership. As I said in that book there, on average, work's killing people when it should be making them healthier. Bad jobs are shortening people's life expectancy. Poor quality leadership is more detrimental for key biomarkers of health than unemployment. It is better to be unemployed, according to these studies, than to be in a toxic environment. And you know as well as I do, any profession where you have to wear a bulletproof vest to go out and do your job every day is a dangerous profession. And I don't know about your experiences, Brian, but it's been mine at times in my career. I felt like I had to dress up like a medieval knight just to walk in the front door of my organization because of the politics and the backstabbing and the infighting that was present every day in some of these toxic organizations. And many times that's inflicted upon us. These things are inflicted upon us by those in leadership positions. And beyond just my perception of things, there's actual factual data to support this. Gallup studies extensively. They're probably one of the largest organizations that does surveys out there, and they have been doing leadership surveys for a number of years. And they wrote a book recently. It's a great book if you're interested in leadership. It's called It's the Manager, and it basically outlines 52 discoveries from several decades of research as it relates to leadership. And they said that while the world's workplace has been going through historic changes, the practice of leadership has been stuck for decades. They said this new workforce that we have, they want to work for an organization that has a deep mission, has a deep purpose. They don't want the old style command and control leadership. They want coaches who inspire them. They want people to communicate with them, to help them develop their strengths. And in this book, they said basically that people don't quit their jobs, they quit bad bosses. And they said that 3 out of 4 people report that their boss is the worst and most stressful part of their job. It's not what they experience out in the community. And beyond that, they were saying that 75% of workers who voluntarily left their organization, there were cultural issues that were at work also. And so it's important for us to understand the importance of leadership. And I think that data that we've seen from the Caliber Press poll that was put out and was responded to by over 10,000 people in this profession really validates many of these things that we've talked about and just how important leadership is in our organization. And leadership's not a position. That's something that I know you and I share in common, Brian. We've had some, I know you teach that also. Leadership's not a position. There are many people who have leadership positions and they're not leaders at all. And conversely, there are many people who don't, and they absolutely are. And I think that we have a positional mindset, especially in public safety, and that many leaders think that they have a position, and people do. They just need to do what they tell them to do. And as it relates to leadership, a real leader knows the difference between being a boss and being a leader. And I think that's something that we really need to understand. We want to get the most out of our people. We want them to show up and put forth what's called their discretionary effort. That's the above and beyond effort that they could give if they wanted to. But when people work in positional organizations and for positional leaders, they show up and they don't put forth the best. And so it's important in what we teach and what we believe is that the real style and only way to lead people is to serve people. We teach a servant leadership model. I think it was Richard Branson, the CEO of Virgin Mobile, said that clients don't come first. The people come first. If you put the people first, that they'll take care of the clients. And I share that philosophy, and I believe that it's true, that if we want to see better relationships in our community, if we want to see things change, it starts with how we practice leadership internally, and we have to be committed to serving our people. Also had the opportunity to hear Dan Cathy, the CEO of Chick-fil-A, talk one time, and he said something that was very simple but very profound. And he was talking to his leadership team, and he said there are only there are only two jobs at Chick-fil-A. Of all the things that we have going on in our organization, you boil it down, there's really only two jobs. He said you're either serving chicken or you're serving people who serve chicken. And they understand servant leadership, and I believe that that's where it all starts. It's so important to make sure that we get the leadership right, because when you talk about, and I use this illustration in some of the classes that I teach, when we send somebody to a training event, we are planting what I call seeds of training intervention. And they take this packet of seeds back into their organization. And if the conditions in the organization are not right, those seeds are not going to grow. I hear a lot of people, they get frustrated. They come to a leadership training class and they say, these things sound great, but it's so frustrating because nobody in my organization, they share these same values, or I can't apply these things because this is not how, the leadership above me sees things in the organization. It's very frustrating for them. Our role in creating, we're like farmers in some regard. We have to cultivate the soil. We have to create the conditions in order for people to be able to thrive. And the root word of culture is to cultivate. And so our job is to cultivate the conditions in which people in our organizations can flourish, that they can thrive, and they can be the best version of themselves.
Excellent. So, there's a lot in what you said there, and I think, it flows to so many of the other, the remaining 4 points. But when you talk about this concept, and I agree 100% with what you're saying, and some things that I have seen is over the 41 plus years that I've been involved in the profession is that we, as you said, have confused rank, position, title with leadership. So we have this mentality of here's your stripes, here's your bars, here's your stars, so now you are a leader. And we see leadership as a course, not a culture. So you have to take this course, you have to take this program so you can tick this box so you can get promoted. But we never bother to ask anybody, what did you learn? How are you applying what you learned? And what are you doing to share what you've learned? And I guess the third thing that you talked about is I think we have created this image that the boss is the way to go. That in your people's face, do what I say because I'm the boss, as opposed to the servant leadership mentality. And I know I just interviewed Jimmy Capra recently, and he retired as the director of international operations for the DEA, but his whole philosophy is you need to learn to love your people and you need to lead from the heart. And so how do we address this leadership void so that we create a culture of leadership? What are some of the keys in your experience to us doing that? Well,
one of the things that my organization, we're affiliated with the John Maxwell company. And so I have really taken a lot from a leadership philosophy that I learned through John Maxwell, and it's called the 5 levels of leadership. And what he teaches is that basically the entry level of leadership, your ticket in the door, so to speak, is your position. And a position is not a bad thing to have, but having a position and going nowhere beyond that's a terrible place to stay. And he says people who work for positional leaders, they give the least of their time, effort, and energy. And he jokes, and one of the things he says is when you're working for a positional leader, that people are asking themselves one question every day. And the question they're asking themselves is, how little do I have to do to not get fired? And if we want to get the best out of our people, I hear a lot of times in leadership training classes, how can I motivate my people? Well, I think it starts by you inspiring your people and creating the conditions for them to be motivated. Now, it's not as simple as that. We have to, I believe, first and foremost in our hiring process, recruit motivated people, but then we have to be intentional in our efforts not to demotivate them. But getting back on track, positional leaders have very little influence beyond their title. And so when you ask for above and beyond effort or people to put forth extra effort and energy, you typically don't get it, and these leaders get frustrated with their people, and they think there's some magic bullet to motivate them. Well, John teaches that if we want to grow beyond the positional level, it starts with relationships, and that's the second level of leadership. He says that people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And I had a challenge with this earlier in my career. I mean, I was taught that, as a leader, it didn't matter if people liked you. You had a job to do. Your job was to get things done. And really, there was a mentor in my life who showed me what leadership was really and truly. and modeled this exceptionally well. And I learned to understand that leadership's an affair of the heart. Many training classes, they focus on the headset, the skills, the techniques of leadership, but leadership at its core is a heart set. And I've heard it said that the furthest distance you'll ever travel in your life is the 18 inches it takes to connect something that you know logically in your head to your heart. And so it really starts with developing relationships with your people, getting to know them, really caring about them. And at the John Maxwell Company, one of the core values is adding value to people. And in order to add value to people, you have to first value people. It's difficult to be a leader and not like people. And I'm not saying that you have to be everybody's friend, but you certainly have to invest some energy into being likable and caring about your team. So you have to invest in the relationships. But beyond that, if you want to grow your influence, he talks about the third level of leadership, and that's really growing your competence. Because I'm sure we've all worked for some leaders. They're nice leaders. They care about you. They know you personally. They're concerned for your well-being. But they may have 25 years on the job, but they've done the same year 25 times. They're not growing in their own abilities. Therefore, when you have problems and you have challenges, you're not seeking them out. And so it's important for leaders to understand that they have an obligation, they have a responsibility to continue to invest in themselves, because if they don't invest in themselves, they have nothing to be able to offer their teammates. The fourth level of leadership that John talks about is the people development level. And I think that this is where a lot of leaders fall short. Many leaders think that the goal of leadership is to obtain followers. And if you are a relational leader, you care about your people, and you're competent, people will follow you generally. But really what separates good leaders from great leaders is that great leaders understand that their responsibility is to reproduce other leaders. It's to multiply leaders. And at this level, leaders are invested intentionally into mentoring and modeling for people and really helping them grow and become the best version of themselves they can be. You find that many people in the senior-most levels of leadership will tell you that they wouldn't be where they are without the mentorship or guidance of some other leader in their life. And I believe that the numbers are like 85% of leaders have said this to be true. But if you look at the same data, only 5% of leaders are actively involved in that mentoring relationship and helping people grow and helping them develop. And when you do those things consistently over time, the goal is to reach that fifth level of leadership, and that's where people just absolutely respect you because of who you are and what you've done for them personally. But, you know, at its core, like you were talking about earlier in the quote from, I believe you said Jimmy Kappa, in Lead from the Heart, that leadership is a heart set. It's an affair of the heart. And if you look at a lot of leadership philosophies out there, you will see at its core, leadership's about serving other people. I believe Simon Sinek said in his book Leaders Eat Last that leadership was akin to being a good parent. And when you think about it, you can't be a good parent if you don't love your kid. And there's a difference, I tell people, between love and like. Now, there are days, and I don't know, Brian, I know you have two sons. I've got a daughter. She's 10 years old. And I don't know, maybe the same is true for other listeners. There are days you just don't like your kids, right? And if you're in a relationship, I would venture to say there are days that maybe you don't like your spouse, but you love them, you care for them, and that's our responsibility as leaders, is to love and care for them the same as we would our own children, to always be thinking with their best interest in mind. Because leadership is not a position, it's a stewardship. It's a responsibility that we have to people. And so anyways, that's I feel like I'm kind of on my soapbox right now, but I'll step down from that. That's my perspective. That's my thought on leadership and leading from the heart.
And it's, I love John Maxwell's work, and like I say, those 5 levels are something that we can look at and determine how we help and grow through that. Now, you talked about the third piece, or the third level of the growing competence, and it seems to me that lends into that second issue that you talked about as the anti-intellectualism, where we are not creating and fostering learning organizations, and I'm in complete agreement with that. I think that what we have this tendency, especially right now, is we want to front load everything. So you need to have a degree to get hired, and then we're going to put you through the academy, and then really that's the end of professional development training. The bulk of the mandatory training in people's careers is qualification, requalification, certification, recertification, and topic of the day training that they attend. So what are some of the keys to developing a learning organization? Because I think this is so critical for us.
One of the things I think you said earlier, Brian, and I agree 100%, is we have to get out of this mindset that leadership training, or any training for that matter, is a check the box. You find that many of the programs, whether it be fair and impartial policing, mental health, first aid, verbal, any training program, a lot of times organizations are doing those because they're required to, because they're mandated to do those things. But if it's not part of your culture, it's not part of who you are and how you operate day to day, those things are going to have little value. I find a lot of leaders do go to leadership development training, and again, it's about building their resume. It's not actually about learning from that experience. And I've actually had people, I've offered them up. I said, you ought to come check my class out. And they said, man, I've been to all kinds of leadership training. And it just goes to show the mindset that they have. And it's not just with leadership training, it's any training. It's like investing in the stock market. It has a compounding effect. And if you are familiar with, or you've invested in the stock market, 7 to 10% is a good return on your investment. When you go to a training class, chances are you're not going to take 100% of that from the class. You're going to take 7, 10, hopefully a little bit more than that from the class. And if that's what you get from it, and that's the only class that you had gone to, that would be like you investing $1,000 into your 401k plan at the beginning of your career and expecting to retire 25 years later without making any additional deposits. And if you're continually investing in yourself through training and actually learning, not just going to the class and actually applying these things and reflecting on them and thinking about them, then it will have that compounding effect. And then hopefully as you go through life and you gain more experience, that those things are able to apply. But we have to look at leadership training like investing, that it has to be something that we're doing regularly, that's recurring, that's frequent. And, I believe in micro-interval learning in our organization. A lot of times we come in and we try to take care of, all of in-service in 16, 24, 32 hours, and we work in every class that we can. And I know it's difficult from a staffing standpoint, but I believe that people learn better in those micro-learning sessions where they can digest the information. But beyond the training, it has to be reinforced through our behaviors. And I think that's where leadership role modeling comes to play. It's not what we say, it's what we do. So I think those are some of the things that really need to be considered. But as it relates to anti-intellectualism specifically, I'd like to say this for just a moment. When you think about it, as a society, are we more concerned with the quality of how we look or how we're policed? And what I mean by that is that if you look at the world of our friend the barber, the standards to be a barber in every state in the United States here, all 50 states, is more than what's expected to be a police officer in any state. And that shouldn't exist. We have one of the most difficult jobs, most dangerous jobs, most litigious jobs out there. It's so multifaceted. And it's sad to say, but like I said, our nation requires more training to be a barber than a police officer. So are we more concerned as a society with how we look? Now I'm all about the importance of a good haircut, good quality haircut, right? But when you think about it, the quality of the decisions made by our police officers as they make inquiries and settle disputes and have to investigate crimes and arrest suspects and give testimony in court and all those things that are required of their job, it's much higher than what's involved in being a barber. And their standards are much higher. I think it was a report in 2016. I think it was something that was reported on by CNN, if I'm correct. But they said that many trade jobs require more hours of training to get a license than it takes to get a police badge. And they also noted that police officers, I think it was in California, received 664 hours of training, while cosmetologists are required to have 1,600 hours of training. And in Florida, police receive 770 hours of training, but interior designers must take 1,760 hours of training after completing their degree. And here in Georgia, the same thing's true. We actually have, unfortunately, in our state, we have one of the lowest requirements for mandate training. It's 408 hours, 10 weeks here in the state of Georgia. There are some academies that are a little bit longer, but really there's no standardization across the country. But when you look at it, as I was saying earlier, many of the trade professions out there require more hours of training than it does to be a police officer. And if you look at it beyond just trades within our country, you look at training standards across the world in other countries. There was a study that was done by U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics, and this was I couldn't find any more recent data than this. This is a 2013 study, but they found on average that police officers across the country receive less than 6 months of basic training. So that's slightly more than 20-week average that's legislatively required. And in continuing to do some research, in 2018, there was something that was put out by the the Institute for Criminal Justice Reform, and they were looking at training requirements in other countries, and they said that the United States, outside of Iraq and Afghanistan, had the lowest mandate for training hours of their police officers. Now, that's pretty scary, and you think about the consequences of a bad haircut versus the consequences of a bad decision by a police officer. And the thing is we're kind of stuck in a time warp. If you look at the unrest of the 60s and President Johnson's reform on law enforcement, so the National Commission on Law Enforcement Administration of Justice back in 1967, one of their major recommendations was that for training and education, that the requirement be 40 hours of in-service training per year. And they also said that we need to incentivize education and specialized training. And they said that all officers should have a bachelor's degree, but most importantly, or most immediately rather, all supervisors should have a bachelor's degree. And this was in 1967. If you look at that today, only 4 states presently in the United States have this requirement of 40 hours of in-service per year. It's Kansas, Massachusetts, Tennessee, and Utah. So, we really haven't, we're like hamsters on a wheel, just kind of spinning. We're not making progress. And the problem with these suggestions in the police reforms is they're exactly that. They're suggestions. It's up to the individual departments as to whether or not they want to apply these things and what it is that they do. So, the solution, we hear a lot of this, defund the police. If we really want to improve how we do things, that's not the solution. The solution is to invest in our officers, invest in our law enforcement organizations. So rather than defund them, we need to invest more money and time in training and education. And training needs to be deliberate. It needs to be focused training that includes real-world situations and high-stress environments. And if we're going to require police officers to have college degrees, we need to make sure that they're compensated adequately. Because if you look, if we're competing with other educated people, you look at what the average is for folks, we're expected to be junior attorneys, we're expected to be professional mediators, mental health professionals, social workers, and what these people make for their 4-year degree is much less than what a police officer makes on average with their 4-year degree. We're always going to need police officers to maintain a civilized society. We're in the midst of a paradigm shift in law enforcement in this country. It's time to strike while the iron's hot. Encourage our local, state, and federal leaders to invest in our officers, to invest in trainings. And we, as police executives, we need to step up and make training a priority in our organization. A lot of times it's the first thing to get cut from the budget when there are budget crunches. It's so important. And I've got my brother-in-law. He's actually, both my brother-in-laws retired from the SEAL teams, and I've got a brother-in-law that spent a number of time on Green Team, which is the specialized selection team for SEAL Team 6 or Dev Group. And, he and I have had some conversation, and he was saying, to do your job, you really, if you're working a 40-hour week, should probably be spending 8 hours of that time invested in training. I mean, your job is that important. You're making life and death decisions every day, and we have a hard time just getting people to do the basic requirements, to get the minimum 20 hours that are required in the state of Georgia every year, and that shouldn't be tolerated within our organizations. But again, Brian, that's a cultural issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, personally, I have my own thoughts on the requirement for a degree to get hired, and I don't believe that we should have that. I think that what we need to look at is skills, not credentials. I think we need to look at, and it's interesting because Adam Grant wrote a post, who is one of the top-ranked professors at the Wharton School of Business, wrote a post that said that, for his recommendation for agencies that had that prerequisite was to get rid of it. He said everything that you can learn at university, you can learn in other areas. And I guess my thought is what we need to look at is learning. So what have people learned, and what are some of the skills that they've acquired? And because they can acquire these skills through alternative routes. But another concern I have is that it's all of this front-loaded mentality, and it's not what you're talking about with building a learning organization where we see learning as an investment, training as an investment, and we create structures to make sure we get a return on investment and have training something that's delivered in those micro doses like you talked about throughout people's careers, that we look at hire to retire and developing people professionally throughout. Is part of the problem is that we have confused minimum standards dictated by Post or whoever the governing body is as a goal rather than a starting point?
Yeah, I think it's probably a true statement, Brian. This is part of a larger issue that we can't solve in the time that we have left together. It's difficult, especially for smaller agencies, and the vast majority of the agencies across the United States are officers comprised of 10 people or less. And, it's difficult for those agencies to meet the training requirements when they have a town or village or city to staff with those number of officers. It's difficult to do that. I say difficult. It's not impossible to increase the standards, but it certainly is difficult. And it's difficult, too, when we have unprecedented vacancies in our agencies and we're short, and we have to be committed to providing our primary service to the community. And so, there can be some constraints, but I think that, my opinion is that a lot of people, they aspire to the minimum standard, and they don't go beyond it. They don't see that as the starting point of training. And they're comfortable with getting their 20 hours and being done. And that goes back to what we were talking about anti-intellectualism. We are not growing, we are not learning organizations. A lot of people don't see the value in training. And again, that's a cultural issue, and it starts from the top down in modeling those behaviors and expectations for our officers within our organization.
Absolutely, and it's interesting because it's I taught through the Department of Homeland Security a number of years ago for an agency out on the East Coast. Now that they had 8 full-time sworn members and a half-time position, and in the 10 years that their chief at the time, who was an ILETA member, had been the chief, he had tapped into $1 million worth of grant money, and their people did a minimum in a 8.5 officer agency, and that 8.5 included the chief, did a minimum of 100 hours of high quality training a year. So I think it's just a matter of, are we willing to make the commitment, make the investment? And I think it's incumbent on people, and you're certainly somebody out sharing this message, but I think it's important on us as an organization in ILETA to help people understand how they can do some of these things and slowly create these learning cultures. Now, you talked about discourtesy as one of the other blocks. Is that go back to the prevalence of bosses, not leaders, and some of this mentality that we've had for a long time in our profession at our academies and in our training, that we actually teach people how to be robots rather than how to be human, so they don't know how to have a conversation. All they're allowed to say at the academy is yes sir, no sir, yes ma'am, no ma'am, and they don't know how to talk to people. Are those some issues, or are there other things that you see that are lending to this discourtesy issue?
Well, I think that a big part of it is cultural. It is how people are trained, and that can be from the academy, and then just perpetuated within the organization. I believe that we first and foremost, we have to be very intentional. If we're talking about creating a positive culture, we have to be very intentional about who we let on board. And right now, I believe that we don't have a selection process. We have an elimination process in terms of how we onboard people. We're looking to fill vacancies in our organization, and we're not being intentional about who we're bringing into our organization. Within my organization, where I serve as the Assistant Chief of Police, one of our values is service. And we do behavioral-based interviews with people, and so we ask for specific examples of a time in their life where they have gone above and beyond to serve another person. And we give them an opportunity to reflect. We don't do gotcha interview questions. We really want them to have time to reflect and come with something very insightful, something very informative, and to provide some tangible examples of behaviors that they've demonstrated in their lives that model what we value internally. we're very selective about who we let in our organization. And I think that most organizations should be too. I think it starts with, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of people want to talk about motivation. I say, we don't, it's very difficult to motivate people. You're better off to hire motivated people and do things not to demotivate them. And I think the same is true in this regard as it relates to discourtesy and respect, is to hire people who value service, to hire people who have a heart to serve the community, who demonstrated that through their lives, who can communicate well, who are not robotic, and not to take these well-intentioned people and to really transform them through our training or through our culture and turn them into something than they otherwise were. And that was the case for me, Brian. When I got into this, I've got very personal reasons about why I got into this profession, why I got into law enforcement. I came up from a really rough neighborhood, not a great home environment. And when I got into this work, I was this idealistic young kid that wanted to go out and change the world. And I started out in an organization, and the academy prepares you extremely well for, at least in my case here, some of them maybe not so much, but in terms of how to talk to people, how to treat people, the nobility of policing. And then you get into an environment where you get in a patrol car with what I term as an energy vampire, and those in most cases are FTOs in our organization, some of the most caustic, pessimistic, cynical people in the world, who tell you to forget everything you learned in the academy. They're going to show you how to do things out here. And they don't demonstrate, a lack of concern and care and respect for the people. And, that sort of manifests. And, like I said earlier, people do what people see. And so I think that, in many regards, it's a cultural issue. But if we want people to treat folks with respect, and I mentioned earlier, police legitimacy and procedural justice, there's a lot of this training going on across the country. And we do this so that people have trust and confidence in us. And they accept our police authority as legitimate, and they believe that officers are fair, and we have to do that to build public confidence. And the four tenets of that: one is treating people with dignity and respect. It's also making decisions fairly based on facts and not illegitimate factors, giving people a voice, and being transparent in our actions. We want officers to do this in our community, but how well are we doing that internally? Are we treating our people with dignity and respect? Are we making decisions fairly? Are we giving them a voice? Are we allowing them to have a seat at the table? And are we being transparent in why we're doing things? Are we being transparent in our actions? Because I believe it starts internally before it can be manifest externally.
And that's such a great point. And it seems to me, while we're talking about culture, that one of the mistakes that we've made, and you had addressed this earlier, is that we're so externally focused. So we bring people in for classes on police legitimacy, procedural justice, and it's about how you treat people outside the organization. And in many organizations, people are sitting there and thinking, yeah, well, I wish they'd treat us that way here. And so the training is a complete waste of time. And I've addressed this with agencies, and I know that you talk about this, and you already mentioned it earlier, that we miss the point that our people need to be number one. We cannot put the community number one, in my opinion, as a priority. The best way to serve the community is make our people the highest priority, invest in them, train them, develop them, create these cultures of leading and learning that you're talking about, teach them, treat them with respect and dignity, and then they're going to, by default, transfer that out to the community. Is that something that you've seen, that we struggle with this developing in the best way to serve out is we need to focus in and develop in-house first?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that it starts with, it all starts internally. As I said before, you can't give what you don't have, but also you can't be what you aren't. And if internally you're not this, it's going to be difficult for your team to practice these things in the community. Now, we all have to own. We all have accountability. We all know that the right thing to do is always the right thing to do, but it certainly does. It makes things difficult. And Brian, you and I had a conversation last week, and we were talking about what we've seen happen in Minneapolis. And whatever your thoughts, your opinions, your feelings are on that situation, that's not the point of what I'm about to say here. But really, what degree of ownership does the department have in this behavior? if this was a problem officer and they knew about it, did they condone it? Was this part of the culture of the organization? Was this how people were treated? And if it was, the leadership in the organization has to take some responsibility for these things also. The way that people treat people the way that they're treated. And if we want to improve police-community relations, we have to improve the relationships that we have internally in our organizations.
And that's such a great point. Now, you talked about investing in the people, investing in the organization, creating this culture of leading. And you mentioned FTOs, and it seems to me that trainers, academy trainers, in-service trainers, field trainers are in perhaps the most influential leadership position in organizations. Have you seen that we fail to have people in those positions understand the influence that they have and investing in their leadership training so that we can maximize that investment in developing the culture of the organization?
No, absolutely. I believe that the field training officer, and then trainers for that matter, are the most influential people that we have in our organization. And it's frustrating for me to see, and I've done classes across the country, and I know, Brian, you have done much more so than I have, but the people that are generally in our leadership classes are people who already have a position of leadership. And one of the things that I like to do is I like to ask people, if you had a field training officer or even an officer who's only been on the street for a year and they come to you and they want to come to this class here, what are you going to say? And it's sad to see that many people say no, they don't have a leadership position yet. So many people think you got to get the position before you get the training. But what they don't understand is that leadership's not a position, leadership's influence. And so I ask them, who are the most influential people in your organization? And many times what they say, it's a frontline officer. It's not them. It's the frontline officer who's shaping the perception of what the community believes about us and what we do. Also, some of the most influential people in our organization are our trainers and our field training officers, and they shape the perspective of the officers who are out there providing that service. If they're the most influential people in the organization, and if leadership is influence, why are we not providing them with leadership training on the front end? And as a matter of fact, if you go back and you look at President Obama's task force on 21st century policing here, the fifth pillar as it relates to training and education, one of the things that he said was, or that the commission said rather, was that we need to provide leadership training to all personnel throughout their careers, not one time, to all. And so it's important to understand that leadership's influence, these people, these trainers, the FTOs are the most influential people in our organization, and we need to enculturate them in what leadership is and what's expected of them. Many field training officers, they get field training class. They may cover some things that relate to supervision and management, but I've not seen a lot of them that really speak to the heart set in leadership. As a matter of fact, that's why I started my company, because I've been to a lot of training, Brian. I've been to many of the top executive level leadership training classes out there, and I found that most of it is supervision and management centric. It really doesn't get to the heart set issue, and until you connect the heart and the head, like I said before, I believe that we don't see behavior change.
Absolutely, and I would encourage people to go back and seek out some of the interviews in the previous learning labs with Dan Green and Jason Devlin, who are working to put the T in the FTO and make FTOs trainers and coaches and leaders and mentors, and they've got some great information. So it seems to me that what we need to do is start leadership training at the academy, make it something that we cover throughout the academy, not just 1 2-hour block or 4-hour block, then weave it through FTO, and then weave it through people's entire careers, where we're continually developing or investing in them in small chunks to develop everybody's leadership skills. Is that part of how we create these cultures of leading and learning? Absolutely. I believe that, and if I was in charge and I could wave a magic wand, that's exactly what we'd do. Leadership training would not be a class for those who have a position. It would be something that is ingrained in our culture, starting with the academy. But again, understanding that training fails a lot of times because people go into an environment where these things aren't practiced. And so the most important component, the most important piece as to whether or not this is going to succeed beyond the training is, are the leaders in the organization creating the right environment? Are they creating the right culture for these things to thrive? Are they modeling these things? Do they actually believe these things and practice these things in the organization? Because that is the key. Now, I know that what some people are thinking is, you know what, Frank, I'm 100% on board with this, but you don't understand my agency and the people at these, whatever these top ranks are. But it seems to me that if we as trainers, academy trainers, field trainers, in-service trainers, and frontline leaders take the responsibility to look after the people that we have the honor and the privilege of leading and create these cultures within those groups, then we can then, by default, have a pretty significant influence on the organization as a whole.
No, absolutely. A lot of people want to advocate their responsibility because things are not happening above them or it's not part of the culture. But we're all responsible for our own culture. Our team, we have a subculture within the larger culture, and it may not be something that's modeled organizationally, but the right thing to do is the right thing to do, as we said before. And so you have a group of people that you're responsible to. And you can practice these things within your own group, but you can also be part of the change through developing your influence. I tell people, you know what, and it's a quote from Theodore Roosevelt, you need to do what you can with what you have where you are. And a lot of folks, they want to complain about the problem. It's easy to identify what they are, but what are we doing to be part of the solution?
Absolutely, and I think if we get more solution focused, then and realize that really the people at the patrol level and the frontline supervisors are the face and the future of the organization, and we need to make sure that we're investing in their leadership development and leadership skills. So a lot of great information that you've shared today, Frank. Now, what's the best way for people to find out more about you, reach out to you about the services, or if they want to follow up in this conversation or reach out to you find out about the training and the services that you offer? And I know that you have a couple of big events in August, one of them which is built around this area of influence. Can you talk about how people can find out more about you and get a hold of you and about those events in August?
No, absolutely. I appreciate that, Brian. So my organization is called Guardian Leadership. You can learn more about us through our website at www.guardianleadership.com. If you'd like to get in touch with me, my email address is frank@guardianleaders.com. Again, that's frank@guardianleaders.com. And all my information is on the website there. So if you just got that, guardianleadership.com, you'll get all the contact information there. We offer a number of different services. We've got a leadership training program that focuses on developing self-leadership, team leadership, and organizational leadership called the Guardian's Path to provide a comprehensive development plan for people. And we do conferences, keynotes, leadership retreats. There are a lot of different things in the leadership arena that we do. But one of the things that we're really excited about is our leadership summit we have coming up in August, of which, Brian, you will be speaking at. So thank you for volunteering to be part of that. For the last couple of years, we put on a public safety leadership summit, and that's a philanthropic event that we do every year. And all the proceeds from that event go back to various public safety nonprofits that we divide between our speakers who volunteer in their time to present at this. But we're really excited this year to be able to partner with two of the largest leadership events in the United States. Well, actually, one of them in the country. One's called the Global Leadership Summit, and that is actually the largest two-day leadership event across the globe. And there are people from all over the world that attend this event. There's some very prominent speakers. You can find this information on our site on the Global Leadership Summit. It's a two-day enriching experience. You can do it online, virtually, or you can attend a host site in person. And then on August the 11th, we're doing an event. We're partnering with LeaderCast to serve as the premier host in the Atlanta area for an event called LeaderCast. And it's the largest one-day leadership event in the world. Some very prominent names in leadership will be speaking at that event also. And I know you'll be speaking there also, Brian. So, great events, great development opportunities. And the good thing is that if you have travel restrictions, is that all of these events are going to be offered virtually, so you have the opportunity to participate in that with your team. And I really encourage you to do so. If not our event, the other two events are two of the most enriching events that I attend every year. And I think that you'll get a lot of value and quality leadership development training from those.
And I would encourage people to go to your website and check out all the services that you offer, but check out those events because, the investment is extremely reasonable from a financial investment standpoint to attend all of the events. And like you said, we can do it virtually. So if travel is an obstacle, then there's a virtual option. So Excellent. Now, the question I'm asking everybody at the end of the season 4 interviews is one resource that you would recommend to fellow ILEAD members to help them become a better trainer. So I would encourage them to check out the things that you just talked about. But is there another resource, a book or a podcast or a training program or something you would recommend to help people to become better trainers?
I believe that leadership and training go hand in hand. And so one of the books that I would recommend, it's probably not so much a training book as much as it is a leadership. But an actual friend of mine, he lives here in the Atlanta area. His name's Ron Wallace. He wrote a book called Leadership Lessons from a UPS Driver. And in that, he talks about how do we create a culture of we, not me. And I think that what exists in many organizations is it's a self-interested focus. And in Ron, interesting perspective, he started as a driver at UPS and worked his way all the way up to the president of the company. And he wrote about his experiences and what he learned and how he created this culture within UPS. It's a fantastic read, and it's not a difficult read. It's a matter of fact, it's a relatively short read. I think only 146 pages, so rather reasonable. But it's one of my favorite books, one of the best books. And as a matter of fact, we pull a lot of the stuff for our Developing a Culture of Leadership Excellence course that we do from this resource. So I would certainly suggest that you take a look at it.
And I would echo those sentiments. It's a great book. Ron is a very interesting individual, and had the pleasure of meeting him a couple times and having some conversations with him, but tremendous recommendation. So Frank, I want to thank you for making the time for the interview, carving the time out of your schedule. I know you've got a very busy schedule, and I appreciate you carving the time out for this. But more importantly, I appreciate everything that you've done in your 20 years of service in law enforcement, all of the training that you've done, all of the things that you do through your company, through the training that you do through your organization, and now your involvement with ILEAD and the training that you've delivered through the conference and hopefully future conferences. So for everything that you have done, everything you continue to do to make such a positive impact in our profession, thank you so much for your commitment and your energy and your service.
No, thank you, Brian. I really appreciate your time and ILEAD and everything you do for all the trainers out there. Their job's so important, and I want to thank them. Everyone who's listening, really, you are the key to change in our culture, and these things cannot happen without you. And I really just want to thank everybody who's listening for continuing to do this job in spite of everything that we see here, and your commitment to the growth and development of the future leaders of our profession.
Excellent. And I want to thank you, or echo those sentiments and the thanks to the listeners for being an ILEAD member and for being a trainer. As we talked about in this interview, being a trainer, you are in one of the most influential leadership positions in this profession. Being a good trainer is a lot of work, and I thank you for making that commitment. I encourage you to let the information that Frank shared with you in this interview simmer, percolate overnight, and be intentional about sitting down tomorrow, taking at least 10 minutes, ideally longer, and just start writing out what I learned from that interview with Frank. And after you've exhausted all of that, then write out your action step. What actions are you going to take to implement what you learned? And that's such a critical process to reinforce that learning and to create those action steps. A note for the listeners: since this recording was done, Frank has been hired as the Chief of Police in Stockbridge, Georgia, where he had the opportunity to start a police department from scratch. And he's implemented many of these principles around the key elements of culture into the creation and the ongoing development with the Stockbridge Police Department in Georgia. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this interview. I trust that you found value in the information shared during the interview. To join the community of thousands of trainers who are committed to advancing law enforcement training and get full access to all the benefits of being an ILEAD member, go to ILEETA.org, that's ILEETA.org, and click on the members link, then on the membership application. If you have 3 or more trainers in your training cadre, then please consider contacting our Director of Operations, Jenny Merlin, at jmerlin, that's JMERLIN, at ILEETA.org for information on bundle memberships.